let's get started here. Thank you for putting where you're dialing in from, zooming in from. Thank you for putting that in the chat. Really good to see where people are coming from. So let's get started with this webinar, which is about how the UK's ethnic minority communities, how they're served by democracy, how we're all served by democracy. My name's Jessica Metheringham, the chair for Unlock Democracy, and tonight your chair here as well. This is one of the things I do, and I am really pleased to do it this evening with three brilliant speakers. So we will start with Lee Jasper, who's a former senior political advisor to the Mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, which feels like an awfully long time ago now, and I'm sure it wasn't actually. But you have co-founded numerous sort of Black movements, the anti-racist movements, numerous organizations. So thank you very much for all of that and the decades of experience, the knowledge that you'll bring. We'll then go on to Dr. Shabna Begum, who you are co-CEO for the Runnymede Trust. Thank you very much for being here again. You again have so much, so much expertise. Some to do with education, some to do with access for housing, and just that intersectional stuff, to do with gender and generation and race. So thank you very much for coming. Then we have Breon Wells from the United States, from the Daniel Initiative there. So let's hear from you afterwards about what the United States is doing, how democracy serves minorities, because I think there are some things which are very similar. There are some things which are not similar at all. So this is a real global discussion here. So we are listening to you because we very much need to learn, and this is something where we do not have the expertise at all. So thank you for coming and talking to us. Can I start with you, Lee? Perhaps, 5, 6, 7 minutes about something, then pass on to Shabna, then Breon, then we can, have lots of questions. So people in the audience, please do get your questions ready. There'll be somewhere where you can type them in. Because of the intricacies of Zoom, we're not going to try and spotlight people. So we're going to get to your questions, but it will probably be me reading them out. Sometimes I might try to combine a couple to see if we can get through more quickly, but brevity would be rewarded for questions. So just bear that in mind when you're thinking of them. So if I could hand over first to Lee Jasper.
Hi, and thank you for that welcome. And I'm glad to be on a panel with so many illustrious speakers from home and abroad. Some of them I know and some of them I don't. So welcome and hi to everybody. Unlock democracy. Well, it certainly needs unlocking because it's completely broken. My view is that Westminster democratic traditional party politics is a sort of relic of the 20th century that is no longer fit for purpose to meet the systemic challenges of climate change, systemic racism, poverty and indebtedness, and so on. That has been a hallmark, really, of 20th century democracy. Where we are today is a democracy and a Westminster party political system that is corporately captured. And unless you are in that milieu, unless you are prepared to submit to that authority, then your chances of faring well in our current party political first past the post democracy system are not good at all. So I don't think we are represented well as Black and ethnic minorities. By the way, we're not ethnic minorities, actually. We're actually global majorities. Only 20% of the world is white, so the rest is Black and brown. And I know in Britain we use that term, so it's not a criticism or any sort. But I think as a global African, I want to make that point at least. But coming from that standpoint, that we've seen that the policy of Black faces in high places as a sort of, a goal in itself of representative democracy hasn't fared well. We've got more black faces in high places than we've ever had before, and racial equality is at its greatest ever level that we've seen in decades. So there is no direct, there's no direct relationship between representative democracy and justice for black people, if I can just put it as blunt as that, because that's where I'm coming from. So I think that, look, we've got a 20th century concept. It's not 20th century, isn't it? I mean, when was British democracy invented? Isn't it? Oh, 1,000 years old. I mean, so we've got a 1,000-year-old product that is now no longer fit for the 21st century. And what we need to do, of course, is push the reset button on democracy. All of the scandals that we see on Westminster, the impact upon the general public is that people just lose faith in politicians and democracy because they never mean what they say, and they never do what they tell you they're going to do. And so having a new system of democracy, one that is capable of meeting these existential challenges, one that is capable of pushing democracy down and democratizing communities at the grassroots level, one that is based on ethics that are enforceable and transferable, one that is votes for 16-year-olds, maybe based on proportional representation. These are all of the elements that I think should be part of a new constitutional discussion, especially for the UK that has left Brexit. Because unless we're a 53rd state, or is it 54, I can remember, of the United States, and I know that that's how it feels for us at the moment. The lap, the poodle to the American bulldog. But if we are to define ourselves as a country going forward, what does a 21st century multicultural democracy look like? Does it look like this? I don't think it does. So I think there's a real opportunity now to have a national debate about what modern Britain democracy looks like. I think it's definitely an issue that is becoming increasingly pressing as people feel marginalized from the party political processes. I spoke this weekend to the group of African, Caribbean, and Asian councillors from all over the country at their residential conference. And I did some research before I got there. And I found out there is not a single black elected local councillor under the age, black male elected councillor under the age of 30 anywhere in the country, period. And when you see the lack of representation of certain groups within our communities in terms of the party political process and their sort of anemic attempt to deal with the issue of systemic racism, I have severe doubts whether the sort of current party political system is capable of delivering for us. So I think we need a brand new dispensation. I think post-Brexit, if there's any time to have it, it's probably now. I didn't agree with the decision, but given we are where we are, maybe it's time to think, what does Britain now look like in the future? And what does democracy 3.0 look like? And how do the marginalized African, Caribbean, and Asian communities in the UK suffering under the yoke of systemic racism and discrimination, how can they find relief and solace in a new constitution that, in the words of Ubuntu, I am me because you are you. And if you can't be you, then I can't be me. And in some senses, I think it was Lila Watson, the Aboriginal activist back in the 50s. He makes this very point, as well as Audre Lorde. We are the ones we've been waiting for, but without a proportional representation, without a new democratic system, without the kind of legislation that prohibits the corporate capture of our democratic process, then I fear, quite frankly, for a future which is already pretty grim in terms of the systemic global challenges, environmental, political, and social that we face. And in summation, I don't know if you know the Elderman Barometer Trust. I've been a fan of it for quite some time. It's a global trust, global survey done once a year that says, what's people's faith in democratic institutions, both globally and then on a country by country basis, published once a year, very respected. And their their analysis today in relation to UK is that public trust in democracy, particularly parliamentary, local councils are trusted a little bit more, but not much. But for parliamentary Westminster democracy, public trust was at its lowest level. And they asked this question every year, and for the first time this year, they got a different answer. They asked whether it was time for a new political party other than the Labour and the Tories, the mainstream political parties. And this year, for the first time ever, the majority of British people said yes. And I think that's indication that people, and particularly young people, are completely hacked off, dissatisfied, and have seen their future completely squandered by a neoliberal democracy that is captured by big money, big capital, and huge lobbying influences.
There's always someone who doesn't press the mute button or doesn't unmute themselves. And today it was me. I started saying, thank you, Jasper. Thank you, Lee. And I realized that I had muted myself. So, Lee, Jasper, thank you very much. Just before we move on, there was one question which was about, you said no black male councillors under 30. Were there some female ones? Vicky Seddon has asked that. Excellent. Oh, you've now done the muting thing, I'm afraid. Sorry, I passed the not muting on to you.
97% of all local councillors in Britain are white. So let's get that clear. Yeah.
Yep. And
the majority of all of those councillors are over 60. Yeah. So there are some black women under 30, but it's very, very small numbers. But there are no black men under 30 are an extinct species in terms of local democracy.
Thanks, Lee, for that clarification. Let's move on now to Shabna. Shabna, please, your turn.
Thanks, Jess, and thank you, Lee. That was really a really strong start to the conversation, and I really welcome both the contributions you've made both tonight, but also in the decades of service that you've given to the Black community, and in particular talking about democracy. So the Runnymede Trust is a race equality think tank, and we've done lots of work around this. And I guess, obviously, we talk about, and I take Lee's point about global majorities. We are talking in the domestic context, so I will refer to minority ethnic communities. But I think it's probably worthwhile starting off by recognising that actually the health of our democracy is in a really a poor state, just generally, regardless of kind of who it's serving. So if we're thinking about the kind of indicators that Lee was just identifying there in terms of trust, levels of trust have fallen considerably. We know that voter turnout has also, there have been some increases in more recent elections, but actually generally the trajectory is going downwards. And when we talk about political efficacy and how well people feel in terms of connection and being able to voice and have influence over the political process, we know that actually there are very, very low levels of confidence in those processes. So that's a general kind of diagnosis of a very poor democracy. In terms of how it impacts on minority ethnic groups, again, I think it's really important to emphasize, as Lee did there as well, that we are a diverse communities. We have a range of different class profiles, and I think some of that class issue is represented in some of the representation issues that Lee identified in his contribution as well. But if I do start with that kind of voting infrastructure and just think about democracy in terms of voting, we know that there are lower numbers of Black and Asian people are registered to vote. So compared to white people, we know that registration levels are consistently lower and have remained lower. And so there is a democratic deficit just in terms of the numbers of people who are registered to vote. We also know, and again, Lee identified this, the age profiles, that younger people are less likely to be interested and less likely to go out and vote right now and to be registered to vote. And that does not tell us anything about their political appetite or their activism, but it does tell us about their engagement with the kind of democratic process. And I think that's a really important distinction to make. We've also seen not only the fact that there is this democratic deficit in terms of voter registration. I think that the legislation that the government brought in last year, which is about voter ID requirements, that has been really, really unhelpful. It's something that the Runnymede Trust actively campaigned against. We knew it was going to have a detrimental impact on our communities. And in the May local elections that were held earlier this year, the Electoral Commission, an independent body, found that or estimated that if we repeat the kind of numbers of people who are turned away from voting at the local elections, that there are up to about 800,000 people who are likely to be turned away at a general election. That's nearly 1 million people being turned away at a general election because of new requirements that were brought in, requirements that were supposedly to address electoral fraud. There are only 6 cases of electoral fraud that have been prosecuted successfully. We're talking about a poisoned cure, a cure for a problem that doesn't really exist, and which erects significant barriers for certain communities, more so than others. And so we would argue that very strongly that the government needs to remove those barriers. And again, that aligns with age. We saw discussions around what voter ID was acceptable, the travel card that pensioners might use was legitimate as a voter ID requirement, but young people's equivalent form of public transport, Oyster card, was not acceptable. So again, unacceptable barriers that are going to disproportionately impact on minority ethnic communities. And if we leave aside the voting infrastructure and then we think about what about representation, again, Lee outlined the really, really poor low levels of representation that we have. It's no good for us to have black and brown faces in high places if those people are not going to represent the interests of our communities. But even though we kind of see those faces, there is still a significant underrepresentation. So if about 13% of the UK population are aged 16 and over and are from minority ethnic backgrounds, that does not correspond to the numbers of MPs that we see in Parliament. We have 66 members of Parliament who are from minority ethnic backgrounds. If it was truly representative of the population, we would have about 104 minority ethnic MPs. So there's a significant discrepancy in that. And if we look across all of the national parliaments and assemblies as well, there is a similar level of discrepancy in terms of population of those countries and the representation that's achieved in those assemblies and in those legislative assemblies. So there is a problem with the people who are getting through to represent our communities. But also, I think it's really important to note the treatment of people, what encouragement we give to young people who might be thinking about getting into politics. So again, we know that particularly from an intersectional, a gendered perspective, Black women MPs are much more likely to experience the kind of hatred, trolling, abuse, both from individuals, but also the media as well. So it's not just kind of individuals that can be blamed for this. We're talking about the treatment of those MPs by kind of our democratic systems, the media, the press, and so on. And so, for example, the Amnesty International talked about the levels of abuse that were received by women of colour in public life. And Black women were 84% more likely than white women to receive abuse or problematic tweets than their white counterparts. There is a real problem in terms of how our Black and minority ethnic representatives are treated when they are getting into those positions of power. The kinds of the kind of double standards that are also applied in terms of expectations of those MPs as well, and whether that's the Diane Abbotts of this world or whether it's Zara Sultana, who talks about the Islamophobic kind of abuse that she's got, one of the youngest MPs. We have a real problem in terms of how our minority ethnic MPs and representatives are treated by the system, not just by individuals, if they get there. And then I think that the third part of what I wanted to talk about was that, well, how does our democracy represent the interests of our communities as well, right? So it's about voting, it's about representation, but actually democracy is about representing the interests of communities. And we can see, and I would totally agree with Lee on this, that in terms of serving the interests of our communities, we have seen over a decade worth of cuts to public services. We've seen austerity. We have seen cuts to our social security system. Those have disproportionately impacted Black and minority ethnic communities. We have seen the kind of benefit changes that have happened, the regressive tax benefit measures have taken away more money from Black and minority ethnic communities than they have white working families. We published a report called Falling Faster, which was looking at the cost of living crisis. The cost of living crisis isn't experienced by everyone on the same terms. Black and minority ethnic communities are much more likely to be experiencing deep poverty. That we're talking about destitution, again, a word that I did not expect to use in 2023 going into 2024. We are talking about people who cannot afford to eat. And we have a government which is intent on pursuing these kinds of policies, despite the fact that they do not serve and in fact inflict harm, actively inflict harm on our communities. We've got criminal justice policies that this government has proposed and is implementing. Civil liberties legislation, I think, again, the wider part of our democracy, where the right to protest in the context of what's going on in the world right now. We have seen just over the last few weeks, our Home Secretary really making some quite dangerous statements about what can and can't be said. We have seen an increase of a police presence in schools to police what children are saying in schools in response to global events. A healthy democracy requires civil liberties, requires free expression. It requires people to be able to express their dissent and opposition to government policy. And right now, I would argue many of those policies are actively harmful and actively criminalize Black and minority ethnic communities. And my final point, and then I will hand over, I guess, we're going into 2024, and 2024 is going to be an election year, and we have already seen where in the past, historically, where the race card has been played by political parties to win very cheap points. And we've seen that begin during the conference season. We've seen conversations around migrants, the Stop the Small Boats, and how that is really trading on the cheapest form of politics, where you create an other, and that other is very much a racialized other. And I think that is deeply harmful. And again, the health of our democracy requires us to think about not only about voting and representation, it requires us to think about whose interests are served by the people in power. And if that's not served by this political system, then we do need some fundamental change.
Thank you, Shabna. That is really powerful. I particularly like the fact that you drew out of there how there are so many different demographics and how they intersect, and that thing about, you know, Black women getting so much more abuse, you know, the double standards there, that it's not just the political system, it's the media system, it's the social, you know, basically the whole way that our society is put together. So it's not just one thing, it's multiple things layered on top of each other, and I think that is really important. Can we on then to our last speaker for the evening, Brion, from the United States. Can you tell us something which will perhaps give us a bit of the global perspective here?
Sure. Thank you very much, Unlock Democracy, for having me. And I appreciate my two newfound colleagues, very much respect deeply what you all have had to say. And I think, so my name is Brion Wells. I live in Washington, D.C. The Daniel Initiative is a government relations, strategic communications, and social impact firm. And we represent the interests of course, a variety of policy issues, but our main focus is on Black people, brown people, persons with disabilities, LGBTQ+, because in the spirit of Fannie Lou Hamer, none of us are truly free until all of us are free. And so I would start where really Dr. Shabna and Lee kind of set the groundwork, which is we see a lot of what is happening, not just in Britain, but across the globe, as in some ways bleeding and a manifestation of what has already happened in the United States. So we bring up photo ID laws. We have been there, we've done that. We have the championship belt, unfortunately, and it has worked horribly. Or I would say very strategically, maybe for some who were, strategically and knowingly trying to other certain voices. When we talk about Brexit, that conversation of migrants who bore the brunt of the misinformation and strategic disinformation was really a copycat of our whole border policy faced towards the U.S. South. So Latin America, South America, Haiti, the Caribbean, right? Africa. These conversations especially had always been there in some ways, but were given voice and rise through our last president, President Trump. And we see kind of this way that it flows over. And so I would say, as I was contemplating, when we use these terms, democracy, capitalism, these things, I think we often don't take the time to make sure that we have a true agreed upon definition. I think sometimes these words have been built, not by all of us, but by a few of us, and then we just refuse to look back. And so one of the things that was on my mind is this idea of tradition versus transformation. Anytime we refuse to evaluate and reevaluate traditions, we stymie the transformational aspirations that we sometimes say we want. And I'll use as an example then this topic of democracy. It's easier to define democratic ideals than it is to define democracy itself in a way that works for everyone. But I'll land on one here. A system of government by the whole population or all the eligible members of a state, typically through elected representatives. So if this definition is true, and as Lee talked about representation and Dr. Shabna talked about both representation and voter engagement, I think I want to pick up on that towards accountability. A hallmark of any sort of democratic ideal ought to include accountability, because if this is a system of government by the whole population, then this means that they then, as they have entrusted their vote, they have empowered their vote to these representatives, there must be a level of accountability. The problem we had in the United States, and I remind people all the time, we never had a diversity by face problem in the United States. We had Black people, we had Indigenous folks, we had Asian Americans, you had all sorts of groups, you had women. But what we had was not an equal access to power. And that equal access, or that access to power, is through voter enfranchisement. It is through access to the ballot box. Our Constitution literally stated that Black people were 3/5 of a person. And even then, that was by Republicans in the North who found not that they cared about Black lives, but they saw an opportunity to have a one-up on the slave owners in the South. Or maligning Indigenous folks as savages. This kind of subclass of naming these otherings in some ways allows you to feel that you have a democratic society, but you always move the eligibility goalpost. You always move that space, and then you continue to move past it. So what we did in the United States is we fast-tracked after the Civil War, and then the passage of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery in most contexts, is still alive and well in the criminal legal system, the criminal justice system, which is another space we just lead in, I guess, here in the United States. But then the 14th Amendment, which was equal protection under the law, and then the 15th Amendment, which really kind of gave Black men the right to vote, supposedly. And we need to be very clear in particular. Black men were given supposedly the right to vote. So that meant Black women were not. That meant, white women were not. It would not be till the 19th Amendment that white women were given the right to vote. But you even had people like Ida B. Wells, And Sojourner Truth, when Sojourner Truth says, "Ain't I a woman?" she's talking about the fact that white women's vote had been restored, but they had been out there championing along with them for those rights, and they were still seen as not equal, not eligible enough for this. Those rights would not be enjoyed either by Black men nor by women of color until the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in 1964. So that means that was 100 years between the promise versus the guarantee that we had to long fight for. But what happened and transpired before then was the Jim Crow laws. And it was this consistent system of othering, this system of, now that we have to acknowledge that you are a human being and that maybe you can participate in this thing that we call democracy, this is where we see the robust prison system that we have, because we now move to criminalization so that we can have a reason to now bail you back out of the system that you were supposedly brought in to enjoy. And so, you know, the reason I bring this up is because of the fact that we have to understand that when we use terms, especially here in the United States, like systemic, institutionalized, and structural racism, or systemic, institutionalized, and structural sexism, what we're talking about is, and I would say this is particularly, not exclusively, but particularly unique in the US system, it was the extent to which we didn't just have the stigmatization of Black people and brown people. We didn't just have the little cliques and the clans that were whispering and having off-color comments, or even carrying out brutal, violent actions, physical violence, which was in employment. But it was the utilization of legislation. It was the utilization of policy, embedding these racist ideals into policy to give it long-term intergenerational effect. So when we talk about the struggle for representation, as Dr. Shabna just brought up, or when we talk about in this country, the fact that we have high mortality and high maternal morbidity rates amongst Black women and brown women in this country. And when we look at it, we think, oh, maybe it's because they didn't have access to health care. Maybe it's because they weren't by a quality hospital. No, actually, the reality and the studies, the facts would show that there was a role that sexism and the role of internalizing the racism and having to deal with that played on the stressors of the body. And it was in some ways responsible for this system that sits up under this democratic society that we aspire to. And so I think we need to evaluate when we use these terms, like we're moving forward, when we have these aspirations and these expectations of democracy, how broad are we willing to go? And how much are we willing to confront the traditions of the past to be able to get to the transformational imagination and systems that we are asking for? I think that when Fannie Lou Hamer, and I'll end here, said that none of us are free until all of us are free. When we're talking about not just minorities, but specifically Black, I'm mindful of, as Lee said, there is a whole Black diaspora. Some people were confused or surprised after the murder of George Floyd here to figure out that Black Lives Matter was not just in the United States. You had Black Lives Matter chapters in England. You had Black Lives Matter chapters across Europe. You had Black Lives Matter chapters in other countries across the globe. It's this notion that our freedom, our liberation is tied, yes, to persons with disabilities. Our liberation is tied with other ethnic minorities in their country, even though we make up the majority outside collectively in the globe. It is, you know, in some ways hard, I think, for some Black and brown and you know, people of color to sit still as we even look at the current massacre and tragedy that did happen in Israel, but also the reality that has been happening to Palestinians. We resonate deeply, right? We can hold space on one hand and say this was a massacre and there must be justice on this side, but also say, let's not forget the longstanding injustices that have been alive and well and excused on another side. And so, you know, we don't do ourselves a great service when we are isolationists, when we work in these silos. And so one of the things that I'm proudest of that we have done at the Daniel Initiative, we help people understand what is the intersection, since a lot of this has been furthered through policy. You can't talk about racial justice without talking about environmental justice, without talking about criminal justice reform, without talking about, you know, immigration reform, without talking about digital equity, without talking about health equity. All of these things are intersectional. They are compounded, and there are folks in our societies, particularly women of color and Black women, who are compounded the most. They bear the brunt on 7 different spectrums, because they may be a female that is in poverty, has lacked education because of the system, was formerly incarcerated, is part of the LGBTQ community, is an immigrant. Right there, that's 6 different ways that when we're writing these policies behind closed doors, it has this impact that whether we want to acknowledge it or not, hurts. And it doesn't just hurt the communities we think that it's pointing towards. When our Black women, when our brown women, when our immigrants are hurting, our whole block is suffering economically. Our whole block is suffering politically. And so it causes us to have to get out of these silos. And I speak, you know, really, and this is where I'll land, from a space of knowing I was privileged to be born. My father was an Air Force, you know, member, and I was stationed in, my father was stationed in Royal Air Force Base, Alconbury, England. That's in Huntingdon. And so I lived there in my high school years. I was born in Spain. I lived in Germany. I lived in Turkey. And then, of course, lived the most in the United States. I had the pleasure of working both in the Obama administration and in Capitol Hill for 8 years as a senior policy advisor. And so being able to see from this global perspective that oppressive systems are not just relegated to one nation state or another. They are global. And also understanding that policy is the nexus that gives it its life through generations. I also believe then there's an opportunity for us to have generational positive responses globally and generational positive solutions through policymaking and legislation. But we must be courageous enough to be introspective and reevaluate our traditions so we can get to transformation.
Thank you very much. That was, I mean, for a start, that was really passionate. And there was a lot that spoke directly to me, and I think it spoke directly to the audience. The thing that really got me, I think, in the middle there was about the fact that we don't even have, we don't have agreements about what these key terms are. And I think that is a really important thing, that you started with. What is democracy when it's being defined by some people as being something completely different? But then you have things about how people can use the tools of oppression to get at particular bits of them, and sometimes they're really overt, and sometimes they're not. Here in the UK, we tended to use so voter enfranchisement was often based upon money. What property did you own? What money did you have? What were you as an individual worth? But right up until 75 years ago, we still had the additional votes for those who had been to certain universities. So they got an extra vote and other people didn't. And I think that is, that's, how all of these pile on top of each other, exactly as you were saying. So thank you very much for that. Now, there are a number of questions. They are all very good questions. Many of them are excellent. So I'm going to dive straight into the questions. And I think the one I'm going to go to first is the third one down, or at least it's the third one down on my thing, from Marisha Ray, who is talking about how European nations with proportional representation can sometimes have right-wing or fascist parties, which can be active and influential, which campaign for the oppression of people who are not white. So when you're all talking about how these things fit together in society, what can we do to prevent that happening here? Now, clearly in the UK, there are already people, who are campaigning for the impression of people. But what can we do to limit it? What can we all do there? And, who is most worth listening to on this subject? So if I go perhaps first to Lee, then to Shabna, then to Bree on that. So Lee, have you got anything that you want to share? People who are sort of most worth listening to perhaps on this subject? Oh, you're muted again, sorry.
It's normally the people that are normally excluded from these debates, to be quite frank with you. Maybe, we need an alternative system of democracy that is more akin to people's assemblies and citizens' assemblies, which are based on sortition, which are based on taking away the vested interest of the career politician from out of the equation. What we found, I think what research shows us, is that anytime that you provide a group of people with quality information, they tend to make better decisions than politicians almost on a 100% basis. So I think there is different forms of democracy. I hear the thing about proportional representation, but we've got racists and fascists in mainstream political parties, I would argue, and they're flying under a flag of convenience and so on. When you look at the current government's political agenda and compare it to a National Front policy agenda of the 70s or the British National Party in the 80s, then you find the current government has adopted the agenda of those extreme fascist right-wing politics. So I think that there's no guarantee with anything, but I think that there is a system of proportional representation. But it's not one change that you need to make to totally transform the system. It has to be a systemic change, because I would argue the current system will defeat any attempt to reform it, or any attempt to challenge it becomes under immediate threat. And so unless you're in the game for saying, no, actually, we want to, rip up the democratic roots, start again with a fresh perspective, not hindered by the shibboleths of the 20th century or the weight of dead men ideas. But we invite people for a fresh conversation about how we're going to save the planet and save the people. And that priority should dictate what that democracy looks like.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Shabna.
I agree with lots of what Lee just said there as well. I think that it's really important that this idea that with PR we would be inviting kind of more kind of influence from right-wing political parties or right-wing ideas is sadly kind of misunderstanding where we're at here and now, because actually we have Home Secretaries talking about kind of hurricanes of migrants coming in and kind of catastrophizing what it means to have people crossing the channel in small boats and so on. And I think that the kind of right-wing ideas are alive and kicking very much in our existing democracy, and we've actually got politicians who are manufacturing and amplifying those ideas in a really dangerous and reckless way. I also think that PR, like Lee said, I don't think it's the single solution. I think that proportional representation has its advantages, has its disadvantages. It does obviously kind of distribute power and political representation and seats more kind of closely to how voters might vote. But I think that, as Lee said, the current system, first past the post, we have an adversarial system based on a first past the post system. It's not a simple solution of transferring over to PR. It would have to be alongside a whole transformation of our political system. And I think that one of the key things that we need is for power to be devolved. I know we've had kind of this idea of devolving power to our nations, but I think that, coming back to the point that I raised at the beginning, people's sense of connection and able to influence the decisions that impact on their lives feels so removed moved from where they're at. People's material conditions they feel so powerless to impact on the changes that they need. And so PR in Westminster still feels too distant to the decisions and the decision making that needs to happen closer to the people that I would want to be speaking on behalf of.
Thanks, Shabna. Breon, what do you have to add to that?
Yeah, and I would just add, because I agree with both what Lee and Dr. Shabna said. I would say, who do I feel is most worth listening to on this subject? I would say the directly impacted. That is the aims of collective liberation, is making sure that there is a conduit through which multiple expressions and lived experiences, which makes them the experts, right? It's not just those in the think tanks and those that are policymakers. Those with lived experiences have the expertise, point blank, period. But I also think that we have to move past just listening. To Dr. Shabna's point, if there is no agency past voting, I mean, that's a real thing that we are struggling with even currently in the United States. We have this dysfunctional democratic system that is becoming untenable because we do these get out the vote efforts every 4 years, every 2 years, right? And often these elected officials don't reach out to these affected communities until 3 months before elections. We have a running joke here that says, the politician doesn't find Jesus up until 3 months before he's about to run for an election, but he hasn't talked to, these church entities. He hasn't talked to the Black and brown communities throughout the rest of the parts of the year. But accountability would necessitate that past voting, because the reason I say our system here in the United States is untenable is, while some may believe, and I am one of those that believe, that the policies by some right-wing conservatives have been very overtly harmful and detrimental to Black people, to brown people, and persons with disabilities, multi-marginalized communities. Those on the left, their argument has only been giving us someone to vote against as opposed to something to vote for. And that, at the end of the day, the people who are hurting are looking for the deliverables to what they expressed has been ailing them and troubling them. And so that means that engagement must start at the ballot box, but then what are the tools through which they can continue to engage and even help in crafting of policies? Because again, if we just listen to them and say, okay, but we put it through a white normative lens, it's not going to be helpful and comparable to the people as they've expressed it.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all three of you. Can I go in reverse order now? So we've got a question here, the question best expressed, I think, by Councillor Rabi Martins, which is about the fact that we have a Prime Minister who is brown, we have a Home Secretary who is mixed race, Black and brown. We've got Suella Braverman, we've got Rishi Sunak, and we were talking earlier about how we want democracy to look. Now, at this higher end in the cabinet, we've got something that looks, that might look away, but how much are they actually representing people? So, Breon, you're looking at it, from an outside perspective. How does the UK look at the moment? How does our PM and our Home Secretary, is this looking good or is this not looking good? What's the outsider perspective here?
Yeah, I'd say it's looking quite, and if you want to see its future, look at the United States. And I would say we're on shaky ground here, right? On that. And the reason I say that, we have a saying here, particularly in the Black community, that all skin folk ain't kinfolk. That just because you share the same skin color does not mean that we all think the same. And that's not inherently a bad thing. But this is why when we say the directly impacted, this means, no, you don't just have the one Black person that you decided to invite and the one Indian person. This means there are multiple layers, multiple voices, even within this community. We never stop and ask ourselves in any of these societies, do we have too many white people in the system? I don't know. The quota thing never just quite bends over into the white community. But, the reason I say look at the United States and its kind of sorted, past, I don't want to make it sound like we have not had progress. There has been spaces of progress, but we take 2 steps forward and then sometimes we take 4 steps back. We have now a Congressional Black Caucus. And that Congressional Black Caucus, we have a Congressional Hispanic Caucus. We have the Asian American and Pacific Islanders. These are congressional members who caucus together, for their community. Now, the Congressional Black Caucus, as an example, represents 85 million people. But in 2023, the year we're in now, of those 85 million people, only 18 million are Black. 18 million of those 85 million that they, represent within their districts. The other reality of this is you now have more members of the Congressional Black Caucus who most of their constituencies are white. It is shifted now, right? And so we have, in some ways, this progress that you could have a Black person that's not just relegated to a Black only community, but that inherently starts to show the tension points of when you have these quotas and these, we need 3 Black people. And that, if we don't have Black people that express all the different lived experiences, if we don't have brown people who are also LGBTQ or have a lived experience of what it means to be an immigrant, right? And what it means to have been born and raised in this country and come from a blue collar background. This is the way that we eke at it. And so that we stop looking, because anytime we're counting and trying to figure out these quotas, I'm automatically doubting the sincerity of the system, because we're just trying to figure out how close we can get to check the box when we're dealing with humanity and real life experiences. And the most sincere is to try to do what is just and right and fair for the human being.
Thank you. Humanity is kind of complicated in that way, because we are not, one-track people. We have many different facets to ourselves. Shabna, go ahead.
Yeah, on that, I agree with loads of what Breon just said there, and I think it's really important that I started off by saying that we are not a homogenous community, and we are often not allowed this idea of the fact that we have diversity of views, interests. And I think the most important for the point around Rishi Sunak, Suella Braverman, Kemi Badenoch, James Cleverly, all of these politicians, is that actually it shows the limits of representation, and it also shows the need for intersectionality and an intersectional understanding. Race and class go hand in hand in terms of thinking about the interests of people who are impacted by the kind of policies that I've been talking about. So when we're talking about austerity and we're talking about social security and the labour market and all of the inequalities that we experience, there is a class profile to those issues as well. And race and class go hand in hand. And sadly, I would argue that the current people in those positions are actually doing a disservice, because by being in those positions, they legitimize harmful policies and give kind of legitimacy to policies and validate policies that are actively harmful to racialized and working class communities. And so actually, I would argue that it is obviously more than representation. It's obviously more than about having brown faces and Black faces in positions of power. It's about how closely they are aligned and connected to the interests of the communities that Breon has described as most impacted by the kind of policies that they deliver.
100%. Certainly reading the comments, reading the questions, I think that most of our audience definitely agree with you and are, looking at and thinking, yeah, actually, that speaks to me. Lee, final thoughts on this question, and then we'll see if we can get in, one minor thing before we wrap up.
Yeah, much to concur with what's been said already. Really, there's a clear, class component. We're talking about Suella Braverman. We're talking about Kwesi Kwarteng. These are not your ordinary Black folks from Tower Hamlets or Moss Side or Toxteth and Haringey and Brixton. these are the wealthy elite of Oxford and Cambridge. They have more in common with that elite than they do with us. So, it's the whole point that we made, that Black faces in high places, just a redundant strategy to replicate the existing system, give it a splash of colour, but otherwise nothing remains the same. And in some cases, of course, and Frantz Fanon, the Sahel psychologist who famously wrote Black Skin, White Masks, and he talks about the desperate need of the African elite to subservient themselves to the colonial masters, and he describes a scenario where Black people, indigenous people of power, get into positions and simply just pull the ladder up behind them and then begin to castigate every other Black person for not being able to do what they've achieved under pretty exceptional circumstances. So I think that, look, it's a redundant strategy. We need a better democracy than the one that we've got. It's not just failing to represent, is it? It's brought the world to the brink of extinction in terms of the neoliberal fallacy of continued growth in Western economies. Has led to a consumption rate and a fossil fuel economy that's brought the world to the edge of destruction. So it's not just that it's not failing to represent. It's an utterly broken system.
Thank you, Lee. Now we have 2 minutes until we are due to finish. So I am going to ask each of you to just think for a moment and see if you can say in maybe one sentence, maybe two. You're going to get a choice about this. Whether it's either the main thing which would have an impact, so define, I don't know, the best solution, and it might be that there are lots out there. It might be that there's one thing that you think, oh, hang on, that would cut through, or define the main problem or the main issue. So if you could say in one sentence, the main issue, the main problem, the main solution. Lee looks very thoughtful. Can I go to you first, then?
I'm not sure there is one solution, but look, transparency is a great disinfectant, as somebody once very famous said. Right? And I think if there's one thing that we could do, just the one thing, it would be to remove all corporate lobbying interests from the houses of Westminster and to have ethical lifestyle transparency checks on our leading cabinet members and politicians, and to really enforce Nolan principles.
Excellent. That is a really good thought, and it's getting stored away somewhere here where we're going to think, right, what can we do about this? Shabna, can I come to you next?
I'm going to be much less prescriptive and more abstract and just say, I think we need a radical transformation of the system. I think the kind of emergencies that Lee described are not going to be fixed by tinkering with the system and playing around with the electoral system. We need a radical transformation of our politics, of our democracy, and we need people who actually care to be in the positions of power, to be able to make the difference, and people who care about both the planet and people.
Excellent. Thank you. Rion, last word to you, I suppose, and then I'll have to, say what I hope that we'll do about this.
Absolutely. And I think, I agree with what Dr. Shabna just said, and I'll just add courage. And the reason, and I'll say this antidote then real quick, the Jim Crow era that we experienced here in the United States was not made possible only because of overt racists, but it was also well-meaning white people who loved their comfort more than they loved Black and brown and indigenous lives.
And that is a really good thing for us to finish on, because so this is a conversation we've been having tonight. It is completely not over. For Unlocked Democracy, there is a lot that we need to learn. We need to think about what comforts we are hoarding here at the expense of, perhaps fellow human beings. What are we doing which should make us a little bit more uncomfortable than it does? And I think that's a message that I can take home, and I think that Unlocked Democracy can look at that more, should look at that more, has a duty to look at it more. we want a better democracy. We want one that's got a written constitution, that's got more transparency, that has a system of voting which is closer to the people, that brings democracy closer to the people in general. So, we have to follow through on that. Thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you to our panelists. It has been absolutely great to hear you speak. Does Tom want to say a few words before we leave? I haven't actually asked Tom if he wanted to say a few words, but I see that he is lurking here in one of these Unlocked Democracy things. So I will pass over.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jess. Really only just to thank our outstanding speakers and just to reinforce the point that you made, that this is, I guess, the beginning of a path that Unlocked Democracy is on. We have some issues to address, I think, ourselves as an organisation. This was the first event that we held for Black History Month, but I think now that we've held it, we will make sure that this sort of event is not something that happens in October, but will become a regular feature of our activities. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you all, and goodbye.